Welcome to another episode of the IFC's Individuation podcast. I have a very special guest with us today. Miss Karen Appel is here. She is the bright spark that runs the machinery behind the machinery. So I am the face, but she is actually the person who runs things. So, Karen, why don't you say hello to our listeners and introduce yourself?
Hello, listeners. I'm Karen, and I'm a naturopathic medical student at Bastyr University, and I graduate in just under 200 days, and I'm very excited about that. And I plan on working as a primary care physician in the Seattle area, and I am also intricately involved with the Institute for Conflict and the Jungian Advanced Motor Processing treatment that Dr. Lahab created, and I'm also a new friend to Isaac.
Yes, I'm here too.
So,
And go ahead.
Can I introduce you, or do you want? Are you in a hurry to introduce yourself, dear?
I'm in no hurry, and I don't think anybody is.
Our partner, our friend, our enlightened one. We like to refer to him.
Yeah,
Mr. Isaac J. Miller is here from the Daily Archetype. This is our simulcast that we do. We are doing Map of the Soul by Murray Stein, and we are doing chapter 3 on psychic energy, which I have a lot of comments about, but let Isaac introduce himself and then we'll move forward.
Okay, well, I am part of the Daily Archetype, and like I mentioned before, this has always been interesting stuff to me. And I think I mentioned last week how people often ask me, like, how does a person get in, like, where does a person start with, Jungian psychology? And in the past, that's been a complicated answer, like that can be all over the place because Jungian psychology is a little bit vast and deep and all those things, like you'll see in this book. But when I came across this book recently and finally got into it, I've been excited to see that I feel like the best place to start because you get the lexicon straight up front. And I was going to say too with Karen, I'm excited for her future podcast. I sort of joke, but I when we sat down and we did, we worked together a bit on the conference back in October. I said, wow, you know how to like ask questions and you know how to do this emceeing. You should do a podcast sometime. So this is her getting her feet wet. And also I like having people on like different levels of, like, Dr. Lahab has been in this for many decades and I'm like a couple years kind of intermediate, and Karen is very smart and interested in news. So I like these different levels that we're in. So yes, it's exciting stuff. We're going to discuss, like you said, chapter 3 of Dr. Murray Stein's book. Oh, one thing that I wanted to get from you, Dr. Lahab, is you mentioned a bit how you had worked with Dr. Stein personally when he was in Chicago and you were. So can you tell us a little bit about that before we get into chapter 3 about like your personal involvement with him over the years?
Yeah, well, so Dr. Murray Stein was an analyst for a very long time. He still is. He still sees, I think, a handful of people. I don't know how many people he sees. He runs ISPI, which is in Zurich, which is the institute that teaches Jungians to become analysts. So he was my analyst for a long time. He was my mentor, analyst. I met him through Mike Hudak, who was my best friend who passed away from mesothelioma. Wow, it's been, I think, 8 years or so. So yeah, we have a long history with the Jung Institute in Evanston, which was very close to home, which we found as a getaway. And at that time, it was very active, and we had several speakers, Jungian speakers, come from all over the nation and the world to speak at the Jung Institute. At the time, the Jung Institute, that was partially donated by June Singer. There was other people who also donated very generously to the Jungians. But it was also part. It was like an old funeral home that they had
Okay.
bought. So it was a very fascinating place. I
Interesting.
mean, they didn't have funeral theirs
Mm.
or bombings or anything, but
Wow.
they is still kind of the history of the place.
Mhm.
Um, I think they eventually lost that building for whatever reason.
Mhm.
Very expensive to maintain.
Mhm.
You know, they partied with the good old days and kept inviting people in. So
Mhm.
nobody really knows the true story of exactly how it fell apart.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, Dr. Stein was a very, very um,
How long did you have a
big
personal
part.
relationship with him back in that area, or working with him personally? I know you
Well,
kept in
I
touch over the
think
years.
that. So I think I met Dr. Stein. It's been a while. So um,
Throughout the 90s.
90s probably.
Mhm.
Um, and then I started seeing him, and then he moved to Zurich and ultimately in Switzerland, where him and his wife retired.
Mhm.
I still continue to have sessions with him by phone for a
Mhm.
while, and then,
Wow.
but he presented at the Institute for Conflicts first conference,
Oh yeah, Karen was there.
and we have that on our YouTube channel if anybody
Mhm.
wants to check out Dr.
Mhm.
Murray Stein. And he basically sets out a psychic law.
Mhm.
And that psychic law is actually the initial parts of that psychic law was in chapter 3.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Nice.
Good
so
segue.
yeah, so why don't we start to
Mhm.
talk about
Sure.
libido?
Yeah, yeah.
Why
So,
don't we start with you, young man?
oh, start with me. Okay. Boy, so
Tell us about your libido first.
tell you
Just
about my
kidding, just
libido.
kidding. Well, we don't know.
Well, that is it's a interesting slash, I don't know, fun distinction to make that Dr. Stein tries to straighten out really upfront in the chapter, that libido so an interesting thing about this book too is that he gets into a lot of the history of how certain things came about, including, especially because uh, Jung worked with Freud, and then they kind of split, and he went into that a little bit in the chapter 1, chapter 2, I believe. Um, so Jung has a very different conceptualization of what libido is compared to Freud, and so he sets that out up front. And it's not even that, like so much with Freud and Adler at the time, and Carl Jung often made these distinctions. It's not that he said they're completely wrong. It's that he made the distinction that, yes, there is this sexual life force, this energy that manifests itself to a certain degree in sexual energy, but that's only, the surface of it, or that's only part of it. And and such always happens, when we're like discovering new things, is you can latch on to like a new discovery and be like, this is it, this is it, this is it. Where, and this is kind of like the whole thing with Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, is that uh Freud was like really wrapped up in sort of the personal unconscious and the sexual energies, where Carl Jung basically was saying that is true, but there's so much more beyond that. And that's what we get into in this book. So in chapter 3, like first it starts off making that distinction, and then it kind of goes into this transference of energy and what's really going on
Well,
there.
well, let's not go too far. Just to
Sure, sure.
stay with that idea
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I like where we're starting.
yeah, yeah. It's a good starting point.
Let's. What were your thoughts, Karen,
Mhm.
on the beginning?
Well, my initial thoughts were there's a lot of drama between Freud and Jung that I didn't know about, and it
yes.
kind of adds a little flair to this book because it's just woven in there.
Yeah.
People in psychology have had a lot of drama. Psychology always brings out. Go on, Karen. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. And similar to what Isaac was saying, it's like Jung took it further. Like it starts with sexuality, but then there's evolution, that the energy evolves and it becomes something else, something more. And that's where Jung kind of continued with the theories. And yeah.
Well, I think part of it is like staring at an apple. There are different sides to the apple and it's curved. So when you're staring from one side, you see the curvature to a point. When you're staring to the other side, you see the curvature. And when you are explaining it to the person who's seeing it from the other side, they say, yeah, I see exactly what you see. But they actually do not see what the other person sees. They see a different curvature. And what Jung noticed was that, yes, that the life force or life energy or libido, as Freud called it, had definitely a high energy conductor of procreation or the need to continue evolution. And I think that's what Freud would have contended, that the sexual drive was to continue the evolution.
Right.
What Jung noticed was there were these particularities about symbols.
Yeah.
And how the symbols show that the symbols had meaning in themselves beyond the sexual act, even though the sexual act was contained within the symbol.
Right.
So I think what they were looking at was just different curvatures of the apple, or even different definitions of the apple. The apple was used to tempt Adam into committing the original sin, but the apple is also a symbol of wisdom. The apple is also a symbol of seduction. The apple is also a symbol of beauty. It's also food. So there's many different aspects to that symbol. And I think that's what Jung started to question, because that ultimately led to the end of their relationship, was the theory of libido. And he knew, Jung, that if he had marked his ground and talked about the way he saw the drives or the psychic energy, that ultimately would lead to the end of their relationship. What do you think, Karen?
Yeah, I agree. And the symbols that is talked about at the end of the chapter, that was something that I found very complicated. And the differentiation between, okay, this is a symbol and a sign are not the same things.
Right.
I was like, okay, can we go into that a little bit further?
Well, then the symbol is part of the archetypal structure. The archetypes are moved into searching for and identifying symbols. It is a way of knowing, and that's inherent in us. It's the way we differentiate. It's the way we understand the world. We understand the world symbolically.
Yeah, and sometimes I often think of this phenomena that we often forget about, but that this concept of being expected that we're going to die of old age is a new concept. Up until about 150 years ago, through all history, the average life expectancy was somewhere in the 30s. That of course includes, it's a little bit lower, partly because high child fatality rate. But I mentioned that because just because of that, and us being so, for almost all of our history, compared to this little flash in the pan the last 100 or so years, our our history has been tied up in a lot of it unconscious of the idea of survival, which is very hard, and procreating enough to keep the lineage going. Now that we're transported into this world that we're in now, where that's not the case, and most people will, maybe, I don't know if it's necessarily old age or what you want to say is the cause of death, but most people in the modern world, will die in their 70s or 80s or more. So for all history, we were in this sort of thing where we're thinking about always how to procreate, how to stay alive, the drives for hunger, the drives for staying safe, the drives for all those things were really important compared to especially now. And now we still have all those same exact drives, but they manifest differently. How that we get our homes, how that we get our how that we operate in our relationships. And so what happens is that transfers into symbols and archetypes. So now we're all about keeping ideas alive, and we're all about keeping mythologies alive. We're all about keeping ideologies alive. We're all about all these things that in the past it was so like rooted in the physical being, and to a large degree it was, but over time we have transformed that into a symbolic one, which is keeping ideas and mythologies and ideologies alive. And it's so this chapter is about transference of energy, because before the energy was all about keeping ourselves alive again, but now it's about like we will die for an idea, even a country. We will die for or ruin our reputation or ruin who we are over like a business or over an amount of money and all these like invisible, untangible things. So what's happened over time is we have taken that life force and we've put it into these mythologies that we're living out and we're largely unconscious of.
Well, let's explore this a little bit, Isaac.
Sure.
So let's think about this life force. Let's think about the psychic energy, and let's think about the energy as being conscious, because I think what we're talking about is that what they were sniffing out, maybe they dare not say at the time, was that the psychic energy was conscious, and that consciousness is what drove us.
Right.
The psychic energy that they call libido is the consciousness of that which we call human. So
life force.
If this is our life force and this is our energy, and our energy is to maintain our existence and our understanding of our existence, then according to you hypothesize that 150 years ago, everybody lived to 30 and so on and so forth. Well, that's a huge statement, but okay, let's take that for
average life expectancy compared
let's take
to
that. No, for sure. Let's take that. Let's take that for what it is. But so each generation we know is born with a different consciousness from the past generation. Okay, where's this coming from? This consciousness is coming through the energy. The energy is what gives us the aha moments.
Right.
The aha moment is the energy has just woken me up to something I didn't see before.
Right.
Even though I looked at the same symbol 20,000 times, I didn't see what the 20,000th time I saw in that moment. Right? From the 19,999.99 times, this time it made a difference.
Right.
Why? So I would speculate that the energy is conscious, and that consciousness is maintained within the energy because that's part of the life force.
So when you say conscious, by the way, you mean has a life of its own?
No, that it's an
a part of
ability
consciousness.
to each piece of it. If we take it to the micro pieces, okay, each bit of it has its own form of consciousness.
Yeah.
And that creates a picture, and that that related picture is what we move with.
Right. Yeah, what you're describing, I don't have the page in front of me, but Stein, I think, calls it psychization, where there will be one of these energies. And by the way, the thing with this chapter is it can maybe seem a little bit all over the place, but the reason is because this is almost like the fuel or the driving force, or I don't know, maybe you could think of it as like a ship on the ocean, and it's the wind that powers that sailing boat or sail ship, so to speak. And so the reason that's important is because it can seem all over the place, because it goes into symbols and it goes into our sexual drives, our hunger drives, and all these other drives. It goes all over the place because it's this life, power, and energy. So it'll go into these different manifestations. But what it is this that we're talking about in this chapter is the study of what moves this drives and these motivations. And so that's going to be different. And yeah, and then those take on a life of their own. And how they take on a life of their own, it gets in a little bit of what we talked about in the previous chapter. And because the previous chapter was on complexes, the next chapter is on archetypes. So it's interesting that this is in the middle of those, because those are what take on a life of their own, is the complexes and the archetypes, which is
the chapter itself, right, Isaac? There are 4 parts.
Mhm.
One part is about the break with Freud, which is a huge part of the history of analytical and psychoanalytical psychology.
Right.
It's the break between Jung and Freud.
Right.
But he also added how Jung understood psychic energy. And he also added how Freud embraced his philosophy. And he also added, so there are different points there are different points he tried to cram into the chapter.
Right.
At the same time, I think this is where, as I was reading yesterday, I was like, hold on, can we stay on this subject?
Yeah.
And I think that's what do you think, Karen? What
has been your perception of this or idea? Go ahead, Karen.
Well, this chapter in general, we've been talking about the energy, and I like how there's discussion of the 2 different perspectives of how the energy acts. Like, you can either look at it of a perspective of it starts here and then it goes somewhere else, or you can look at it as the perspective of it's being drawn to the end, so that you can look at the end and feel like something's being drawn to it. And then Jung is somewhere, he takes both those and kind of morphs them into his theory. And I've never really thought about I've been in the mind of cause and effect, right? I've never thought about the end is already there, and things are drawn to it. Like that's a whole nother perspective that was new to me, that I thought was very, very interesting. But that draws a chain of events to itself.
Ooh. Yeah. So let's stay with that, Karen. So what you're saying is that draws the chain of events. This is where Stein got into the issue of physics.
Yeah.
And the issue of energy, that energy, laws of thermodynamics, is that energy can neither be created nor destroyed.
Right.
Okay. So what that means would be it's immortal. And thus, this is where the consciousness comes in. It's it's an active force that's been around for millennia. It's not our active force. It is an active force. It's part of the consciousness of this planet.
And then there's discussion of how the energy is in the conscious, but it regresses and goes into the unconscious, but it's always, the totality of it is still present, but it's the movement in and out of the conscious and in and out of the unconscious.
Right. That was a really interesting part for me too, and I wanted to read a little line on that, because what he's talking about is how there are these inferior functions, and the inferior, so like normally your I don't know if you call it superior function or your driver function, if you're introverted or extroverted, and if you are thinking versus feeling, or intuitive versus sensing. The opposite will be in the unconscious. It won't like go away. We all have these same forces, but just some more consciously and some more unconsciously. So Stein says, so the libido regresses and typically activates the inferior function. In this case, the introverted feeling function, as an example he was giving. As Jung pointed out, the inferior function is unconscious and carries the slime of the murky depths with it when it comes out into consciousness. So the point there is that, and this gets into the issue of like individuating and becoming whole and becoming whole and healed and healthy, is when we are unindividuated or immature, things go in and out of the unconscious and it can be like slimy and gross. But when we become more mature and more whole and more individuated and more healthy, we can allow that to happen in a conscious manner, that it can come out as beautiful creativity rather than some slimy junk that can go in and out, which is like a typical thing, especially as you'll see in like toxic relationships, is, you know, people are pushing each other's buttons, like we learned about in the last chapter. It comes out in a natural way and people can sort of like beautifully touch each other's buttons and bring out the best in each other. So yeah, that was a good transition that was being made on how things go in and out of the unconscious.
Well, this is the part that I found very interesting, because this is the part that we talk about in JAMP, which is we are we are moving energy around in the psyche and the body. And I think Stein states it that the psychic energy is in the body as well as in the mind. It's not in one place. And that the archetypes are there. They're also an instinct. On the one side, they're an archetype. On the other side, they look like an instinct. I would add to that, on the other side, they would look like a complex. So you have all these different sides to the archetype. The archetype is both controlling, liberating, defending, and evolving. So the archetypal structures,
it's destroying as it creates too.
It always does.
Yep.
We know this from what Jung says, is that nothing can be created if something cannot be destroyed.
Right.
But as we know from physics, again, the law of thermodynamics, what happens is that the energy is not destroyed. It transforms.
Right.
It transforms from one substance to another substance.
Right.
And I think what we do in Jungian advanced motor processing is that we are bringing out those slimy, murky energies that have been trapped.
Yeah, shadow.
And we are helping them recirculate in the areas of consciousness.
Right.
And that's where the relief is, because now those energies are not pulling you down into the ground. They're not pulling you down into the unconscious. They're not pulling you down into spaces where the energy is just battering you.
Right.
So think about you in a boat in a very stormy ocean, and there's no sun, so you cannot see where you are, and the water is slamming you left and right. But as soon as the sun comes out and you start to see where the ocean is. You start to see where the winds are coming from. You start to be able to anticipate what is happening, what's in front of you, what's behind you. And that's what the Jungian advanced motor processing treatment does for you. It recirculates the energy that's been tied up in the unconscious.
Yeah, well, it brings about a flow. And the reason that sort of little metaphor works, it's like in a lot of, I guess, older literature or even mythology, there would often be this symbol of like, you know, a swampy area. And now what's interesting, I don't know how much of it is consciously done or it's just like unconscious, but it works, is in a lot of more modern stories or movies, there will be times where people will be in sewer type areas. And like even one scene in one of the original Star Wars movies is where, you know, they're in this garbage dump in like the belly of some spaceship. And so
that's the evolution that we're talking about.
of the
That's
symbol.
the technological evolution that we built.
Right.
But on the same one you're
Mm-hmm.
talking about, Luke is on the in the Dagobah system, and he's
Yeah.
stuck on a planet, and his ship is
Oh.
sinking into the swamp.
Yeah. Well,
Go
yeah,
on.
well, I was just gonna say that's one of them. Actually, I was talking about the one where they're like trapped and they're escaping this
Yeah.
garbage monster. So there's actually two different similar ones. One, Luke is just with Yoda, and he's pulling out his ship from the murky depths of that swamp. And then another one is they're in like some garbage dump and almost get killed by this slimy monster in this little like murky depth garbage area. So all this is to say that in an unhealthy conscious environment, whether it's an individual one or a collective one, because there's always both, there's that slimy underbelly. And how an individual can bring about healing is to recycle those things, to pull things out from the depths, to allow for flow, and in that metaphorical way, but then also in the literal way, which is what happens in this program and in analytical psychology. Is it's analytical because you're bringing about consciousness to the things that are normally unconscious, and then it brings those things out from the murky depths, and then there's flow and healing that there wasn't otherwise.
Your thoughts, Karen?
Well said, Isaac.
Oh, thank you. What do you think, Karen?
I think I agree with what you said. And also I'd like to add that when we are doing what I just realized while you were speaking and talking about Jungian advanced motor processing is that when we're doing that, the affirmation, when we're having people repeat the affirmations, things come up out of the murky depths, things that are unconscious, and they respond in ways that may not be expected by us or them. So it's brought from the unconscious, it becomes aware, and then we can explore it and figure out why, and maybe connect it to a complex and bring that complex to their attention. And it's just words, positive affirmations that can trigger these moments of exploration and these moments of then healing. So interesting.
Well, and I'll want to hear a bit more from Dr. Lahab on this, but basically what, like the older method that Dr. Lahab, for example, was more involved in the past, and even with Dr. Stein, who wrote this book, was to talk through these things, which is great, and there will always be a place for that. But what this new method that we're working on, Jungian advanced motor processing, is there's still, of course, a place for talking through everything like you'd normally do in an analytical environment like that. But because it just is like, let's talk about the trauma because there's probably a complex there. Yep, there's the complex, and then you smooth it into with the positive affirmations, and so it basically fast tracks what maybe would probably normally take a lot longer to bring about healing. So maybe you can talk about that for a minute, Dr. Lahab.
We're also moving the energy, right?
Yeah.
So it's the movement of the energy while you are talking to the complexes, right? With positive affirmations, you're moving the energy, and you're talking to the slime about that you don't need the slime, that you are perfect, that you are amazing, that you are loved, that you are cared for, that you are safe, that you are not alone, that you are magnificent. Because all these things illuminate the darkness.
Right.
And we know from mythology, and we know from storytelling, every story ends up doing what? It illuminates the darkness.
Right.
What does psychic energy do? It illuminates the darkness. The psychic energy is about illumination. It's about showing you things you haven't seen.
Right.
Whether it comes from the unconscious or it comes from the conscious mind. I think Stein talks about, in a particular way, talks about how there's only so much energy. that you have some energy being held in one place, and then you have other energies being held in another place.
Mhm.
And that's why when somebody is more introverted than extroverted, you see that type of energy. And when it's
Right.
introverted, you see a different type of energy, right?
Mhm.
That it's pulling you in a different direction. So what JAMP does is it bypasses the introverted, extroverted part of the
Mhm.
process. It bypasses the gatekeeper to introvert, extrovert, and it says it doesn't really matter. We need access to all the information.
Mhm.
We need access to all the energy, is what JAMP does.
Mhm.
JAMP is asking for, I want to see where the energy is. I want all the energy. And so when the energy starts to move, that's when we have transformational experiences by people where they have these amazing dreams that are so symbolic.
Mhm.
It's because that energy, that movement has occurred. So I think that's what happens with JAMP. And I think that this chapter talks about how energy is something that's moving around, but it's not always split up in the ways you think about,
Mhm.
but it's always connected. It always has a push-pull. It
Right.
always has one side up, one side down, or one side in the light and one side in the darkness.
Well, it also makes me think of sometimes it's described. Okay, it's a later chapter because I've gone mostly through the book. I forget what chapter that.
You're jumping chapters.
Well, but it's relevant. But the
Okay.
reason is because he gives this example of this thing that Carl Jung drew out and is like one of his very few diagrams. But basically, he's saying, it's almost like his quote where, no tree can grow up to heaven unless it goes down to
To hell.
to hell
Yes.
in its roots.
Beautiful.
And
Yeah.
and so what that is we have to be connected and conscious of our instinctual drives, which include sexuality and hunger and all those other things that are instincts. But we also have to be connected and conscious of the spiritual ones. And so we
But the
have to do
instinctual and
both.
the spiritual are all one in Jungian theory.
Right.
They're all archetypal.
Right.
And within the archetype, they will contain both the instinct and they will contain both the symbolic aspect of the instinct and also the what the libidinal or the sexualized aspect of the instinct.
And what it also brings to mind too is how, and I don't know if this is exactly in the book but it's like the difference between lust and love. So like in a lusting relationship, it's about wanting and like getting something for yourself and this unconscious drive. But in a love relationship that a person can have with anyone, it's more about longing. So the longing is like it's a real attraction, and that there's a push and a pull, like a magnetism. If you really love someone in any type of relationship, there's more of like that magnetic attraction compared to drives like switches and balls on and cause and effect, like Karen was talking about earlier, how that if you love people, if you connect on the self level, there's like this chain that you get sucked into. It's like a gravity, which is a lot of what's talked about here too. And this is like a lot of what this whole chapter is about, is this like gravitational pull that we can get sucked into, which gets into like the aspect of like there's these different things that we can have in all kinds of relationship. There can be like, and not just like sexual lust too, but like how that we can lust to take advantage of a person, or lust to just make money off a person or whatever. But on the other
That's
hand,
the
we can,
archetypal defense you're talking about.
right. On the other hand, we can look at people and it can be like a connection of love. Like how can we become more individuated together? That kind of thing. So these are
So Isaac, let's look at it. Let's look at this. So lust would be that part of you that is unfulfilled.
Mhm.
And love would be that part of you that you have become conscious of.
Mhm.
because what you see in the other is a part of you,
Right.
and
It's a
that's what you are connected
reflection.
to. That's
Yeah.
what you are loving.
Mhm.
So the difference between lust and love is that the self is involved.
Yeah.
When it's lust, it's more of the biological libidinal part of the cell of
Mhm.
the psyche.
Right.
Basically, it's, this is what I need, this is how I need it, and I need it now.
Mhm.
With love is more of a like, oh, this is the thing that I ultimately will transform my life. But I'll let Karen answer, because two guys talking about love and lust
Yeah.
is starting
What do you-
to creep me out, bro.
Yeah. Ew, gross.
No.
What do you think, Karen,
So
and your skeleton
I'm
there?
just gonna throw out the idea
Mm.
that can you experience love if you have not first experienced lust? And I don't mean necessarily with that particular person or scenario, but it's like lust is this instinctual thing that is this drive, this will, this energy to be met. And then once it's met, then another demand is needed. Another energy can be reoriented, because that need's been met into maybe a more stable and less instinctual, but still necessary love. So that's kind of what I wonder. Like, if lust is met, then can you move on? Then you naturally are pulled to love. I don't know.
I think both
I
are
like
always
that.
in play. That there's always a certain degree of, because we're talking about libidinous energy, it's not just like, oh, I want to copulate with a person or whatever. It's the idea of like sometimes Carl Jung will talk about the nesting instinct goes in with it. And that's why I say too, it's like on a like lust level, it can be us trying to just like get something from a person or want something from a person, even if it's like we want their money, their idea, their whatever we can get out of them. Same thing whether it's sexually or these other things that we can just like get from a person, or like the way that we would lust after a car or lust after like a house or a penthouse.
We have somebody in the White House that does this all the time on a consistent basis. You know this, right?
Well, it's
He is always talking about lust. Doesn't matter what it is. He wants to fuck it.
Yeah, we all do though on some level. Some more than others, some more conscious than others. Some are very overt about it to an obnoxious way, and then some are very repressed. And that's actually how that Freud really got his chops in that area at that time, because that time and place, that turn of the century in Europe was a very sexually repressed area, and so then it seemed like, oh wow, we figured out there's this sexually energy and everything else, and everybody's having these problems because they're sexually repressed. And to a large degree that was true, but now it's like different, because it's like sex and porn and all the other things associated with it are anywhere and everywhere that anybody wants them. So it's a different world that we're living in compared to 100 or so years ago. But
on the one hand, but the unconscious is always messing with you.
Right.
The unconscious is always telling you you don't have enough.
Right.
And I would say the collective is still not as free as you may have alluded to. The collective is still not allowing you to show your porn and have it all out there, kind of thing, in the similar way that it was in the past. So maybe some steps have been made. We're talking about it, that's for sure, and that's great.
Interesting, yeah. Well, it's interesting because
a lot of movies, Isaac, and a lot of movies these days, where you always had a sex scene in the movies of old. There is no sex anymore.
What's the point anymore? Because everybody's
but the question is that how do you have? It's neither that you need one sex scene or two, or you don't need any. It's not true to libido.
Yeah,
it's not true to a picture of who we are.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that for a while, but you're right. They barely have sex scenes anymore, which used to be the normal occurrence, and actually kind of, I think, largely went away as pornography became more prevalent. And then, well, and without going too much down this rabbit hole, but the like Karen was saying, there's still like, oh, we can't be all out front with our porn. We have to be ashamed if somebody sees our links or whatever history. And sure, whatever. But there should be a level of sanctity too. And so it's like there's certain things that should be like not all out in the open, and then there's a certain degree that they should be out in the open, but it's tricky, and it can cause repressions and suppressions too.
That's the energy, though.
Right,
It's
right,
the
right.
psychic energy that you're
Right, right,
talking about.
Right.
What you're describing is the friction
Mm-hmm.
between the conscious and unconscious psychic energy.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you're describing. You're describing it beautifully. But I
which
think
is what this chapter is about. Yeah.
Karen is also talking about it and how she's talking about the issue of lust and love and how it comes out. But I think what happens is that we the more we think we are conscious, the more we're unconscious of what we're conscious.
Right.
So this is the game that the psyche plays. This is what the psychic energy does. It's like, oh, you see me now, but you don't see me anymore. It's like the same thing with the apple. Every time you look at it, you're like, which side am I seeing? Is the other person seeing the apple the same way? Now, two people can argue about the apple, but they still don't agree on the apple.
Yeah, the image that comes to mind when you mentioned that earlier, it's that famous painting called The Son of Man, which is by a French artist last century, but where basically it's the guy who's like dressed nicely in a suit and he has an apple right in front of his face, so he can't see anything but the apple. But so to the person in the painting, this guy with the apple hanging right in front of his face, all he can see in the whole world is this big green apple. And then us, or the person viewing this guy with a huge apple in front of his face, will be like, okay, we see this whole world and all the dimensions to it of a guy and an apple and everything in the background and foreground and everything else. So everything's about perspective. And that's the tricky thing with consciousness and ego consciousness, which was more of chapter 1, is it locks into what it's looking at, and then everything else becomes unconscious at that time.
Well, it filters it out, and by filtering it out by default, when you filter it out, it goes into the unconscious.
Right. And this works on the individual level, dealing with their own consciousness and unconsciousness, and then also on the collective level, as we take things from things that you two might be conscious of, and then they come into my consciousness, and my things that are in my consciousness go into your consciousness. And so like it's always going on between everybody, and it's an exchange of psychic energy or mental energy.
We talked about this last week. What is complex. Observed is always affected by the observer,
right,
as well as the observer affected by what is observed.
Right.
So it's not a linear relationship. Yeah, that's where we get stuck. When you get stuck, when you're going back and forth, right. That's the linear relationship. This is not a linear relationship.
Circular.
And this is what young people call binary. They say this is a binary argument because they're like stuck. It was like, all you people do is talk about binary things. That's why Jungian psychology is fascinating to them, because it is not binary.
Right. Well, and what it is that in this type of psychology, it's series of circular things, and that's the way the mind really works. And that's why that the physics metaphor works, is because just like everything else in the physical environment and energy and everything else, it's things in a bunch of circles. And that's how it is. So you can get in one thing and you can say like, there's a circular thing between us. It's not a binary thing. It's a circular thing. And then we can like, instead of us, it's like a circular thing between me and Karen. And there's a circular thing between the three of us and a circular thing between us and our listeners when they're listening. So there's always these circles going on at every level, and which is like a spin of an atom. And when you observe the spin of the atom, it changes the atom and the observer. So there's another circle.
I'm going to call them spheres, Isaac.
You're going to call them what?
Spheres.
Oh, spheres actually is a better word for it. You're right, because that has been the tricky thing about the, what do you call it? The model for the atom. It's not the way that it looks, because it's spherical, not circular. So you're right. Spherical or spheres is a better word.
Finish your thought, Karen.
Yeah. Do you have more to add to that?
Oh, no, I wanted that the circle's flat and the sphere is
all over the place.
Fill it up, and it can overlap in multiple directions versus circle's too binary still, even though it's circle, it's still got that flat aspect. But the sphere, it has all of that area that can overlap between me and you and each other, and then our three spheres can all come together. And
it's almost like it's hard to figure out that the metaphor, and the only one that maybe works, and it's hard to even put into words, is that of like, quantum objects. And like we've always been fascinated like this, like that's why we had like the Trinity and the Quaternity, and you'll see things like the Olympic rings and others that are like rings and circles interlocking, but really on a sort of like quantum mental level, which is what this chapter is about. It is more spherical, the way that atoms entangle throughout all the atoms in the universe. So,
but it's the entanglement that ends up being what we are.
Right.
It's one of these spherical aspects, as Jung, as Karen put it. These spheres are, when they entangle with each other,
right,
is when change happens.
Yeah, growth or maturation, or what happens when a person is coming to individuation, as we might call it in Jungian terms, which is a later chapter as well. And that's the tricky thing with all this, is it has to interlink together. So there's always that going on, that sort of interlinking between chapters and ideas, which is what makes these things tricky, but you can't undo it. Yet Stein does a good job of linking these all together well.
Well, yeah, because they look like they're apart. And I think what Karen is saying is that they're not apart, because these spheres are interactive.
Well, right.
I think if we keep looking at them as atoms, if we look at them as the smallest piece of the that makes up atom, which is quanta, that which we are conscious of right now, that we know in physics, we call quanta. But I think these aspects that we're talking about of energy, the things that make up the energy, I personally believe they're conscious, and that their consciousness is what brings them together. And the more they come together, the bigger the consciousness is. As we have seen with the development of the vaccine, the more people came together, the more consciousness there was, the more. But what they used was, an artificial intelligence. They basically ran these models through a computer that was created to represent the collective. So this is the first vaccine that was basically created by AI.
Right. That's why
one of many things that will be created. And we say vaccine, it's actually 20 different vaccines. I think China has 8. India has 6. I mean, we hear about the Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and these others, but there's a lot more. But all of these came about. The Russians have a vaccine. All these came about because of AI.
Well, there are levels and levels and levels of what we call AI and other kinds of intelligence. So
Well,
sometimes,
that's not what I'm arguing, Isaac. I'm not arguing what levels of AI we have.
mm,
What I am saying is that
mm,
this vaccine that was created by the collective
yeah, yeah,
was created by a collective
right,
that was basically organized by an artificial intelligence.
right, right,
So
right,
yes, there are different levels, and of
right.
course, these are not, the AI is not completely conscious, but
Mm,
this is a matter of semantics, because it's only a matter of time
mm,
before we could say, "Oh my God, you know something?" No, that's because you're always late
yeah,
and we're always slow.
mm,
The creation of this vaccine, this is the
mm,
first vaccine, it was created by AI. It was not, the speed in which it was created was
mm.
not people in the lab running experiment after experiment after experiment after experiment. We know how long that takes. That's a lot of sleepless nights, and that's a lot of work, and that's a lot of
Yeah,
years.
decade at
this
least.
one this one was like on, it was like energy. It was the creation of energy.
Well, yeah. So that's like the it's like a it's like in in an individual person, when we become fractured, we can become isolated and become very unhealthy, which is like a person who needs analytical psychology or Jungian motor processing. And so when they become more whole and more integrated, more individuated, then their whole consciousness is communicating with itself in a flowing, healthy, beautiful, non-slimy way. And then what'll happen too is that's when they start to become like a creative individual or a great individual, because they can then flow with the collective better in a healthy, powerful, creative way, and they can start creating things that they never thought possible. Um, Likewise, as that stacks onto every level of society, even just now, when we're like in the past, is like a big deal of having uh, telegram and mail, and having, even just the ability to have, pigeon express, and now we had telephones, and then we had more and more different kinds of moving information around, and all that does is it connects more and more all the minds. And now it's like we're on quarantine, but we're having these, Zoom calls and podcasts, and just connects more and more the collective to be like a more and more powerful consciousness. And to the point of this chapter, that is energy consciousness moving around and becoming more bigger and powerful. And then what happens when it's creating something like a vaccine or anything else that it's creating or doing in the creative world, the more it becomes encompassing of more things in a healthy way, and the more that it focuses on doing a particular thing, then it can create just about anything, whether that's a work of art or a piece of science like a vaccine. It's a beautiful thing, and that's what this chapter is about: is consciousness and the energies moving throughout it in healthier ways. What do you think, Karen?
This is what I think.
Okay.
Yes, Isaac. Yes,
yeah.
that was a great speech.
My speech was great.
I was like, I could feel your energy through this call.
Oh.
And so I'm gonna roll with that, and I'm gonna
roll with
share a paragraph
cool
from the book.
Great.
That when I read it, I thought about you, and because you shared with me when we first met about how you had a previous career, and then you have found your way into studying Jungian philosophy, and so tell me if this resonates with you at all.
Sure.
By contrast, people who get a lot of mileage in the first half of their lives out of their ability to relate well to other people reach a point where this no longer satisfies them. The highly developed extroverted feeling function does not feed the soul anymore. Other potentials demand to be realized. Perhaps introverted intuitive thinking projects like studying philosophy or theology beckon and seem more attractive than another luncheon with friends or one more family gathering over the holidays. The full human lifespan has many periods of significant transformation.
Yes, absolutely. Although what's interesting about the way that you read that and presented it is you doing so the way that you just did gives like, it's almost like looking at the apple from a different direction. Because when I read that, even just like an hour ago, whatever, sort of preparing for this again, I was like, oh yeah, some people do that. But then when I'm like, now you say that, and then I realize, oh yeah, I've done that. I'm doing that. That's like what I'm going through right now in this time transition in life or whatever. And yeah, so it's like what happens is energy moves about through a life. So it's like a lot of times early in life, we might put our energy into social environment, into business. Another distinction along these same lines that Stein made in the book is how that money is like a form of energy or like conscious energy or cognitive energy, and one way to measure it. And so actually what happened that you saw in my little introduction and then like speaking of my career is there was like a spiritual side for a while and then a financial focus for a while. So the energy went from like a spiritual thing when I was younger, I guess, to then a few years ago, more focused on the energy, cognitive energy and money. And now it's in whatever we're doing right now and this stuff. And, but people do that all the time. And where it's like, there's that transference of energy. And I'm sure Dr. Lahab can relate in his own way too, because him being an extroverted, intuitive, we were talking about this when I was visiting with him a few weeks ago, or a couple weeks ago, where we have a similar personality in some ways where we'll get bored with things after a period of time. I know you're more of the like queen archetype, but he and I are like magicians where we'll master something to whatever degree or see that we got it figured out and get bored right away. So yeah, have you seen that, Dr. Lahab, in yourself or people where there will be that transference of energy throughout life?
Well, I could talk about myself, but I'm boring, so I'm going to talk about Karen.
Sure,
but
sure.
I saw in Karen in the last 2 years, she got really involved in the conference
Right.
and thinking about presentations and who was presenting these ideas. And then she got somewhat withdrawn and she wanted to kind of fold up shop. And then she figured that, wait a second, I'm looking at this from a very narrow perspective, or I'm only looking at this apple from one side. There are many sides to this apple, and I keep missing the curve. So there's a lot of things that we start to become conscious of, but we need that original hook.
Right.
I think we get hooked into things, whether it's, making a lot of money,
or being a sea woman. She was a sea woman for like 14 years, right?
I was in the Coast Guard for 14 years. I made my shift, my transformation towards naturopathic medicine.
Yeah, so for 14 years, Karen, what was it like
being
in that consciousness?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was very, it was something that I did. It was sort of started with survival. It was, I wanted to get an education. I wanted to have a job. I wanted to be able to support myself and not have to worry about finances or healthcare. Like I joined this profession and I could do those things. And I did those things. All right. I did my job well. I was an engineer on a ship for a while. And then I did logistics and then I managed money. So, and I did each of those things and I did them well, but it was, and I met my needs. So
you were mostly on the sea during this whole time, right?
No,
you weren't. Okay. That's in my imagination. You were like on the shore.
I was on a ship for 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just
you're killing everybody's fantasy, bro. What they're fantasizing. Why are you breaking with everybody?
Okay, no. So yeah, you were on a ship for 14 years nonstop.
It felt like it.
Okay.
It felt like it, yeah, because it was so it provided structure in the sea of my life, but it was still very nauseating.
Like the sea, yes. Very good.
But it
because it was not
also
fulfilling. It was not fulfilling.
So I think that the limitation was that you are the type of person who's always seeking more. I think that's where the limitation comes.
Absolutely. And then as I rose in rank through the service, there comes a point where I realized no matter the effort that I put in, I wasn't able to get more. I wasn't able to get the results I want. I worked very hard and I wanted to make change, and being part of the government, the change process is very regulated. And that is a way of me saying very slow. So I want to be able to make change in a faster way and have more impact, more results. And that meant, so joining the Coast Guard, I got my basic needs met. And so I was able to transition out of the survival energy, I feel, and then
your
I
lower
could,
libido.
Yeah, it was met. My needs were met, and so my energy trajectory could change into something else, transform into something more where I found meeting in now. And that turned into naturopathic medicine, looking at the body as a whole, diet, lifestyle, nutrition, those kind of things. And so that was a huge transformation in my life.
One thing that comes to mind as you're saying that, and relates to all of us who've gone through these kind of, I don't know, energy transitions, is sometimes we'll be like all about a certain thing, like all about spirituality, and then all about money, and then all about whatever this is. And then sometimes we'll like avoid the other because it's like, I'm over that. And so like sometimes I even find myself avoiding money at my detriment because it was like my downfall for a while. And so, but I say that to say that I think where the three of us and probably our listeners on whatever degree will find that eventually we come into balance where we need things like money and to have certain needs met. And we need these holistic things, and we need these ways to really be impactful in the world. And so we've got to integrate the lower libido, the higher libido, the lust, the love, and everything in the middle and on the side. So
we have to basically reach down and accept different parts of ourselves.
Right.
I think that's what you're saying.
Right.
Is to become conscious of different aspects of who you are and what you are. And we're talking about psychic energy.
Right.
All these aspects of you that you think are you are psychic energy. You're standing around thinking about, what am I going to get if I do this? That's psychic energy. And you're thinking about, can I get more psychic energy? What's interesting is that the more you are thinking about the different aspects of you, the more in touch you are with you.
Right.
The more cut off from different aspects of you. And it's like, I don't want to think about this, or I don't want to think about that, or that irritates me.
Or be involved with this certain thing.
I have a lot of those things. That irritates me. I don't want to deal with that. Those are things that need to be dealt with because they help us become more integrated. And less one-sided, because if we
more balanced,
we'll start walking sideways. We're basically saying, I don't want to walk on this side of the street. I don't like how it feels. Well, this is going to be a problem because your feeling function is always going to be there. So you need to get to where you could say, I know why I don't like this. But it's not gonna it's not gonna break my legs. I could do this. And I think that's the part that we need to think about. That's the part we need to say, I need to think about it.
And you need to feel about it.
Yeah.
Well, that's one little area I wanted to get Karen's perspective too, because usually it's we'll get other people involved over the course of this, but oftentimes it's the two of us males. And the interesting thing I think about a female perspective compared to that of a guy's isn't just the obvious, but it is the way that the brain is wired. And the way the brain is wired is guys can often get very isolated in our whatever our main function is, which is often thinking, which means that's when the feeling side is regressed or repressed to that slimy way. But sometimes I see with Karen how she is primarily a thinking individual, but because I think she's more integrated, the way that a woman is wired to be more of the bifurcated brains connected, then the feeling side can come out in a better way, a non-slimy way. So I don't know. I don't know if
when you say feeling side, you need to explain that to our listeners, because I think you're using feeling side from a Jungian perspective.
Yeah.
You're not using the term feeling.
Yeah. So feeling in the way that we interact with the world. So we can interact with the world oftentimes in a purely rationalistic thought way. And the more that and the more that we do that, it represses the feeling way to interact with the world. And so like sometimes what I see with Karen when we sat and had conversations over the past few weeks is we would have these thought conversations, and then a feeling would come out of Karen as she has one of these epiphanies, and it's like a beautiful, wonderful thing, because it transitions from the unconscious in that way, compared to like a guy that's more isolated in the thinking side. It might not come out so well. So and I don't know if maybe Karen, now having a little bit more knowledge of these things that we're talking about, might have some insight on that phenomena.
So funny story.
Okay.
When I first took the MBTI test that talked about extroversion, introversion, and etc. I took the test, and then I was like, I know what they're doing. They're categorizing, and I knew it was 4 categories, and it was just like a super
I hate boxes
fail,
and labels.
And I came out like in the middle on everything, because I balanced it out.
Yeah, see, females often do that more than guys. Yeah.
It's just like, oh, I couldn't just take the test, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, so I think I was raised in a military family, and then I was in a military academy where I was taking this test. And so when I was so against being an F, a feeler, I was like, I am not a feeler. I am a P. I am super rational.
Screw feelings. Feelings are for
and
losers.
I was like, no, I'm not that. And so like, it was like this really,
wow, yeah,
like a lot of intensity in denying this side. And I think that kind of did permeate my life, where I was suppressing my feelings for a long time, which was not good. When you were a coastie. Yeah, there's a lot of suppression, a lot of not showing how I really felt about things. And that was a long time spent that way. So when I got introduced to Jungian theory and the concepts of the shadow, and accepting, like Dr. Lahab was saying, accepting different parts of yourself as they are, and moving away from the idea I needed to shame part of me that it existed, but I wanted to pretend like it didn't. Like this. So this is all just like an unfolding process, a realization process, and
so you're probably more integrated than you were before as an engineer for 14 years on a ship.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I think there was I had a lot of protection. I wanted to protect myself. And for me at that time, it was suppressing that feeling side. And so now I feel more joy. Right. And I show it because I'm not afraid. I know I need that protection necessarily. At least I've found places where I don't, and it's wonderful.
So probably if I would have met you when you were just a coastie, you would have been more like, civilian, get away from me. Ah! I can bench press 300 pounds. Get away from me, you loser.
That's why they call it the inferior function.
Yeah.
It's the inferior function because we're afraid of it. And therefore we don't want to engage with it. And therefore it's clumsy when it comes out of us. So that's why we call it an inferior function. I think for a long time, feeling to me was I would end up crying over something. Tears would go down my eyes. And I would think that's a feeling. Now that's an emotion. That's not feeling. But it was being afraid of something that was a part of you. Yeah. And the more we're afraid of different aspects of ourselves, the more chaotic it is to live with ourselves.
Right. And anything randomly could make us cry for no reason sometimes.
Yeah, make a cry or angry or feel disappointed or gypped or taken advantage of is because our feeling function is not being nurtured. So we're always second guessing what we're feeling.
And then we often project that onto others rather than maybe cry, like in those situations or just get generally angry. It'll be like, it's because of this person or that person, whether they're in our life or some, person in a corporation
Oh,
or
it's
whatever
what
else.
they said to me. It's the way they looked at me. It's
Right.
they don't like me. They don't love
Mm.
me the way I need to be loved, or
Right.
because the feeling is an inferior function. You're like thinking, am I loved? And do they really love me?
Right.
Do they really want me? What are they doing? Why are they acting weird? It's because it's our inferior function.
Right. Sometimes they call it the child function, depending on how it's read, because it's like that your primary function, or one of your two primary functions, your conscious functions. And again, this is on the idea of psychic energy, and it's what's talked about in the middle of that chapter. Those will be kind of like dominating and be like, "Rawr, I've got everything figured out." And then it's almost like there's a child, or sometimes two children, one may be more mature than the other, the feeling and the sensing, I think in our case. And then those we've kind of put in the back seat because they've gotten hurt in the past, but then sometimes they will cry and scream and try to climb up in the front seat and try to grab the steering wheel like little children.
Well, yeah, then that's part of being nurtured that way.
Right.
So you could grow up in a family that does not like that part of you, and will tell you over and over again, stop being childish. What they're talking about is an aspect of you. They're talking about your feeling function, because your feeling function comes out and it needs nurturing, and they haven't given it to you. So instead of dealing with their own shit and saying, "Oh, look what I've done,"
because you're like an extension of them.
Exactly, an extension.
We're all
of
extensions
them.
of each other.
So they tell you to shut up, don't act that way, be a grown up. So basically, what they're telling you is,
be a man.
You don't need that part, or just
what
don't
they're really
be
saying
that
is
way.
repress that into the
tell
swamp,
whether it's male or female. Don't be that way. Don't be who that part of you that just came out is not acceptable.
Right.
That's a problem. And that problem, it leads to psychic conflict.
It leads to repression, shadow, and complexes. And this is actually a really good example of how a lot of times people think complexes come from only or primarily bigger traumas like abuse physically or sexually and everything. And that's true to a large degree. But a lot of times it just is like these interactions that happen in our development where we're like, oh, we can't ever feel that way. We can't ever think that. And then it causes that. Yeah, it causes that repression.
Yeah, we can't do that.
That leads to complexes.
Yeah, and these are like torture items, right?
Right.
This is a torture list of things that children have to deal with, and this is why it causes so many micro traumas. Right. So there's all these micro fractures that occur because of the things that the child doesn't know what to do with, because they've been told that thing that they hold on to is inappropriate, impolite, not worthy,
and then
heard.
Often what'll happen, and sort of like to use a little bit of a mythological metaphor, it's almost like little monsters go into a cave and become some kind of a big monster or a colony of monsters. So sometimes it can happen all at once. There's a big trauma, big abuse, a big whatever, and then it's like huge dragon goes into a cave. But then what happens probably more often is little micro traumas create these little tiny monsters, and then they fill up a cave or a swamp or whatever within the unconscious, and then we've got to smooth that out to become healthy again and whole.
Yeah, have you seen those movies where they end up like putting all the people who have terrified everybody in the world on one island?
Yeah.
That's exactly
like lepers.
That's unconsciously, that's symbolic of what happens to the child. Is that all these parts of the child that are completely terrifying
Mm.
are put on one island.
Right.
And so that island becomes a source of tremendous energy.
Right.
It starts to pull on energies that are required for other functionings, like hanging out with your friends, like joining a team, or like being social, or like these things become very problematic because you have this island of prisoners that you have to manage all the time.
Right. Or they manage you and you may not be conscious of
Well, that's the observed and the observer.
it. Right.
The observer thinks they are in charge,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not.
Yep. So we've got to integrate the world and make it all connected and whole and healthy.
It's actually jamp the world.
Okay, yeah,
the
excuse me.
world.
Jamp the world. Jungian advanced motor process the world.
Jamp the world.
Mhm.
We want to heal the world.
Mm-hmm.
Are you ready to jamp the world?
Are you ready to jamp the world?
Yeah, that's right.
Are you ready for this?
Yeah, they should be.
How do they get pumped up for a rave, Karen?
No.
That's Karen's
No.
other thing in her past we talked about when she, like 20 years ago or something. I don't know. The rave past. Are you ready for this rave? Come on, people! And then you get.
Well,
like,
that's probably where the feeling function used to come out.
Yeah, it's
For
like,
Karen.
come on,
Yes.
people!
Yes.
Yeah, that's
You
where
could
the
just
feeling
feel the
function would come
music,
out.
Dance to the music, it
Mm.
absorbed you and went through you. That's where it would be released.
For sure.
Totally.
Well, music, by the way, is a
Beautiful.
very, especially in those kind of environments, it brings it. It's especially like in a rave. I haven't been to as many raves as Karen, but in a rave or those kind of concert environments, what happens is, this is why people go to things with like mosh pits and whatever else, is because you're creating a flow state between the music flowing through the air and through the ears and everything else, and the thing that you're doing, some kind of dancing, even if it's like a crazy person, and everything else in the environment, whether there's drinking or other chemicals and some sexual energy and lights and everything else and glow sticks and lighters. It's a flow state of the archetype connecting, even if it's in kind of a silly way. It's a very important thing to do sometimes.
Let's be clear to our listeners that there's nothing in Stein's book that talks about this, right?
Oh,
We don't
well,
want,
yes
we
and
don't want,
no.
We don't want people picking up this book and saying, "What are these guys talking
Yeah.
about? There are no raves in here."
There's no raves. Well, yes and no. The way that it's yes is that we're talking about psychic energy, and this is an example where maybe we have gone to some kind of event, or even just like in a regular concert, and you feel that psychic energy connect to everyone that's there. And sometimes you could even feel that, like if you go to, I know this doesn't happen this year, but years past, you go to like a sporting event and somebody hits like a 3-point shot or gets a goal, and it's like, goal.
Ooh.
Yeah, there's like that psychic energy that you feel flow through people. So no, Stein doesn't give that example, but it's an example of what he's talking about, that flow and connection of psychic energy that can flow through individuals and collective groups.
I hate to put a damper on this party because I love where it's going, but I think we've been doing this for a while now.
Yeah.
So we don't want to take up more of people's time, but let's do this. So next week we are going to cover the psyche's boundaries, instincts, archetypes, and collective unconscious.
Right.
And we're also going to cover raves, sticks, the energy that moves by the music, and Karen's going to share rave stories with us.
Rave stories, and
that are
Dr. Lahab can talk about
unrated,
soccer games.
I think is the term for the MPA.
Definitely
so we will
leave comments with any questions.
Yes. Any rave questions
about the chapter.
So we will be on chapter 4 next week. Same time, same bat channel.
All right.
I am Dr. Lahab Al-Samarrai. This has been the IFC's Individuation podcast. I am Delighted to be with Karen Appel and Isaac J. Miller from the Daily Archetype. We are going through Dr. Murray Stein's Jung's Map of the Soul. And we'd also like to say hello to fellow travelers, BTS, because they are also moved by this book to create album after album. So I wonder if we'll end up like singing a song at the end or something. But no, to be honest, this is fantastic. So Karen, what would you like to send our viewers?
Get us excited
listeners
for your future podcast and YouTube channel.
Well, I just want to say thank you both and all the many listeners we have.
So many.
For your support, because this helped me realize my dream of being on a podcast. And I'm just so happy and excited for all the future podcasts we're all going to do together.
Let that feeling function out.
Isaac.
So thank you for witnessing.
Yes, and noticing. Yes, this is going to be exciting. We may break up the schedule just a little bit with the holidays. We'll see how that works out. But so there'll probably be one more around before or around the holidays, and then we'll finish it up January, February. But this is exciting stuff, and I'm glad we could have Karen with us. Maybe we will again, I'm sure, in some of the future chapters, and maybe some others as well.
She's definitely coming back for next week.
Sure. Yeah. I hope so. And because we want to hear more about the raves.
Yeah.
We didn't have time to get into that today, but we can. The next chapter transitions right into the archetypes and other psychic boundaries and other things. So, this has been very enjoyable, and I love this stuff. So stay tuned. I hope people are enjoying it, and hit us up on social media, anything to let us know anything that the audience is feeling.
All right. We'll talk to everybody next week. From myself, Karen Appel, Isaac J. Miller, I'm Dr. Lahab Al-Samarrai, and we bid you farewell for another week.
Thank you. Farewell.